Pax Thien entered one of the most famous families in the world before he was old enough to understand what fame could take away. Before the red carpets, the flashing cameras, and the global fascination surrounding the Jolie-Pitt family, he was simply a little boy born in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam on November 29, 2003. In the earliest chapter of his life, there were no headlines predicting anything extraordinary, no public narrative waiting to claim him, and no sign that his name would one day become known around the world. He spent his first years at the Tam Binh orphanage, living a life far removed from Hollywood glamour or celebrity mythology. And that contrast is exactly what makes his story so emotionally powerful. Long before he was photographed, analyzed, and folded into one of the most famous families on Earth, Pax existed in complete anonymity as a child whose future was uncertain and whose world was still small, quiet, and unseen. That forgotten beginning matters because it reminds us that Pax's story did not begin as a symbol of fame, adoption, or public curiosity. It began with vulnerability. It began with absence. It began with a child who had no idea that the life waiting for him would be so extraordinary that the world would start defining him before he was even old enough to define himself. And everything changed in 2007 when Angelina Jolie adopted Pax from Vietnam and brought him into a life that could not have been more different from the one he had known. At first glance, the story looked almost like a modern fairy tale. A little boy from Ho Chi Minh City suddenly welcomed into one of the most famous families in the world. But the truth was more layered than that. This was not just an adoption into a new home. It was an entrance into a global narrative already surrounded by cameras, headlines, fascination, and constant public attention. Because by the time Pax entered Angelina Jolie's life, she and Brad Pitt were no longer just movie stars. Together, they had become a cultural obsession, a family the world watched, not with occasional interest, but with relentless curiosity. When Brad Pitt later adopted Pax as well, and his name became Pax Thien Jolie-Pitt, the transformation felt almost unimaginable. In a matter of moments, he was no longer simply a child with a private beginning. He had become part of a family mythology that millions of people believed they knew. And that is where the emotional contradiction at the center of his story begins. The world saw opportunity, privilege, and a remarkable change in fortune, but what Pax also inherited almost instantly was exposure. He entered a family filled with love and possibility, yet he also entered a life in which privacy would become fragile and growing up quietly would no longer be an option. For most children of celebrities, fame is already a complicated inheritance, but for Pax, it was something even bigger. He was not growing up inside an ordinary famous household. He was growing up inside the Jolie-Pitt phenomenon, a family that had become larger than Hollywood itself, watched, photographed, and discussed everywhere they went. Every public outing turned into a story. Every image of the children became part of a larger narrative the media kept building around them. And that meant Pax was not only adjusting to a new family, a new country, and a new life. He was also growing up inside a public myth that had already assigned him a role before he was old enough to understand it. To the outside world, he was the adopted son from Vietnam, the quiet child in one of the most glamorous and talked-about families on Earth. But that label, repeated over and over, can flatten a real person into an idea. The public was fascinated by what Pax represented, yet that fascination may have made it harder for anyone to see who he actually was. And as the years passed, one thing became increasingly clear. While the world kept trying to place him inside the Jolie-Pitt story, Pax never seemed eager to perform the version of himself that public attention was waiting to consume. As he grew older, What stood out was not scandal, attention-seeking, or any visible attempt to turn his last name into a public identity of his own. Instead, he became quieter, more distant, more difficult to read. And that only made people more curious. In a world that constantly rewards visibility, Pax seemed to move in the opposite direction, offering almost nothing for the public to hold on to. But that silence should not be mistaken for emptiness. If anything, it may have been the clearest sign of self-protection. Because when a person grows up under relentless attention, privacy stops feeling like a luxury and starts feeling like a way to survive. The older Pax became, the more his distance seemed intentional, not passive, but controlled. He did not appear interested in becoming a celebrity in the usual sense, and he never gave the impression that he wanted to perform his life for public approval. That is what makes him such an unusual figure inside a family so heavily mythologized by the media. While the world kept looking for access, Pax seemed to be building boundaries, and in that choice, there was already a quiet clue about the person he was becoming. Someone less interested in being watched than in holding on to something the spotlight could never fully understand. That quiet distance becomes even more understandable when we look at what was happening inside the family itself. In 2016, Angelina Jolie files for divorce from Brad Pitt, setting off one of the most publicized and emotionally charged celebrity separations of the decade. For the outside world, it became a story of headlines, legal battles, and endless speculation. But for the children, it was something far more intimate and far more painful. Pax was no longer just growing up inside fame. He was now growing up through fracture. The family that had once been presented to the world as a symbol of glamour, love, and unity was beginning to come apart under intense public scrutiny. And that kind of rupture can change the emotional atmosphere of a child's life in ways outsiders will never fully understand. It is one thing to be raised in the spotlight. It is another thing entirely to watch your family struggle while that spotlight grows even harsher. Seen in that context, Pax's guardedness begins to feel less like mystery and more like consequence. Because by the time he was old enough to form his own sense of self, the world around him was no longer just fascinated by his family, it was dissecting its collapse. Over time, the emotional tension surrounding that family split became harder to ignore, and one moment in particular changed how many people saw Pax. When a private Father's Day post attributed to him resurfaced online, it introduced the public to a level of anger, hurt, and emotional distance that had mostly remained hidden from view. Suddenly, Pax was no longer seen only as the quiet son who stayed out of the spotlight. He was seen as a young man carrying the weight of something unresolved, something painful, and something deeply personal. Whether people viewed that moment as a shocking revelation or as a private wound that never should have been exposed, it revealed one important truth. Silence does not mean the absence of emotion. In Pax's case, it may have meant the exact opposite. The distance people had spent years interpreting as mystery may actually have been shaped by heartbreak, conflict, and the emotional cost of growing up inside a family story that the world would never stop watching. But perhaps the most revealing part of Pax's story is not simply that he became more private. It is why that privacy seems to matter so much. For someone whose life was defined by headlines before he was old enough to define himself, stepping back may have become more than a personal preference. It may have become a way of reclaiming control, a way of protecting the parts of himself that fame, family conflict, and public fascination could never fully understand. And that may be the clearest way to understand who Pax Thien is today. Not as a symbol, not as a mystery, and not only as the adopted son of Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt, but as a young man who seems determined to live beyond the story the world wrote for him. In the end, that may be what makes Pax so compelling. His life began far from Hollywood, then unfolded under one of the brightest spotlights on Earth. Yet the older he gets,
the more he seems to be moving in the opposite direction, away from spectacle, away from explanation, and closer to something far more difficult to protect, a life that finally belongs to him.